It's just past 2 in the afternoon on August 1st, 1999, on Herring Avenue in Ozark, Alabama. A black Mazda 929 has been sitting on the side of the road since morning. No collision damage. No forced entry. A driver's license resting in plain view on the dashboard. To anyone passing by, it looks like nothing more than a car that ran out of gas. Then a police investigator, waiting for a tow truck, finds a lever inside the car that pops the trunk without a key. Inside are J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett, two 17-year-old girls from Dothan, last seen alive less than 15 hours earlier, on what should have been J.B.'s birthday celebration. Each has been shot once in the head. For the next 20 years, the man responsible has a name in no database, a face no one suspects, and a life that looks, by every outward measure, ordinary. He works. He raises a family. He stands in front of a congregation. The only thing connecting him to that trunk is a single biological sample, collected within days of the murders and sealed in a lab. Evidence with no match, waiting on a technology that doesn't exist yet. It will take two grieving mothers, a police chief who never lets the file close, and a scientific breakthrough born out of a completely different case in California to finally put a name to it. This is the story of what happened on that road, and what it took, 2 decades later, to answer the question that never stopped being asked. Who did this? The summer of 1999 sat at the tail end of a decade that, for most of the country, felt calm. Bill Clinton was in the final stretch of his second term, having survived impeachment proceedings the year before. The economy was in the middle of a historic expansion, driven by the rise of the internet and the dot-com boom. Y2K anxiety was building in the background, but for most Americans, it was still a headline, not yet a real fear. In southeastern Alabama, in the Wiregrass region near the Florida and Georgia state lines, that national backdrop felt distant. Dothan, Alabama, was a city of roughly 60,000 people, the kind of place where longtime residents recognized each other's names, where church attendance and small-town routines shaped the rhythm of daily life, and where a teenager driving to a birthday party on a summer night wasn't something anyone thought twice about. It's important to understand that world, because nothing about that night suggested danger. There was no warning sign, no unfamiliar car following them, no reason for two 17-year-old girls to think a drive to a party 10 miles from home carried any risk at all. That ordinary summer night is exactly where J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett's story begins. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were both 17 years old, high school seniors from Dothan, Alabama, and best friends. July 31st, 1999, was J.B.'s birthday, and the two girls set out that evening for a party marking the end of summer, the kind of low-stakes night that thousands of teenagers across the country were having at the exact same moment. What's documented about them is simple, but it says something on its own. They were close enough that when one went somewhere, the other typically went too. On the night that would become the last of their lives, that's exactly what happened. J.B. driving, Tracie beside her, on their way to celebrate. They left from Dothan, a small city near the Alabama-Florida-Georgia border, heading toward a field party in the Headland area, roughly 10 miles from home. It wasn't a long drive. It wasn't an unfamiliar area. There was no reason, on paper, for anything to go wrong. But somewhere along the way, they made a wrong turn, and instead of arriving at a party 10 minutes from home, they ended up more than 20 miles in the opposite direction, in a town called Ozark, a place neither of them had any particular reason to be. That wrong turn is where the night stopped being ordinary. The last confirmed images of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett exist because of a security camera pointed at a gas pump. At around 11:20 p.m. on July 31st, 1999, the girls' car pulled into a convenience store in Ozark, Alabama, a stop that had nothing to do with their planned destination. They were lost, 20-plus miles off course, in a town they had no reason to be in, on a night that was supposed to end at a party 10 minutes from home. Inside the store's security footage, 2 women can be seen talking with the girls. One of them, a customer named Marilyn Merritt, had stopped in with her daughter to buy a drink. Merritt would later tell investigators there was nothing unusual about the exchange. 2 polite teenagers, clearly a little embarrassed about being lost, asking how to get back to the main highway. On the footage, Merritt can be seen pointing, giving directions back toward the road that would take them home. At the payphone outside the store, Tracie picked up the receiver and called her mother, Carol Roberts. It was around 11:30 p.m. Tracie told her they'd gotten lost, but they had directions now, and they were on their way. It was a short call. Nothing about it suggested anything was wrong. Just two girls, a little later than planned, checking in the way teenagers are told to check in. Then they got back in the car. Merritt watched them pull out of the parking lot and head toward the highway, exactly the way she'd pointed them. She had no reason to think about it again after that night, until she saw the news coverage the next day and realized she may have been among the last people to see them alive. Because after that moment, there is no more footage, no more phone calls, no more sightings. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett drove out of that parking lot, and, somewhere on the road between that gas station and Dothan, simply disappeared. It would be nearly 15 hours before anyone saw them again. At 8 a.m. on August 1st, 1999, Carol Roberts called the Dothan Police Department. Her daughter and J.B. had not come home. Officers began searching the roads between Dothan and Headland for any sign of an accident. But by the time that call was made, the car had already been found. Ozark police had spotted J.B.'s black Mazda 929, parked on Herring Avenue around 6:40 that morning, less than a mile from the payphone Tracie had used the night before. The street was residential, but the stretch where the car sat had no houses nearby, just dense woods lining both sides of the road. At first glance, there was nothing that screamed crime scene. The car wasn't damaged. There was no sign of a collision, no broken glass, nothing forced. But officers on the scene noted several details that didn't add up. The car was covered in mud despite no damage, the gas tank was empty, and a window had been left cracked open. JB's driver's license sat in plain view on the dashboard. For hours, the car simply sat there as investigators treated it as what it appeared to be, an abandoned vehicle, possibly linked to a missing persons report that had just come in. It wasn't until later that morning, once Alton Miller, an investigator with the Dothan Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division, arrived on scene, that someone found a way into the trunk. There was no key, but there was a release lever inside the car that opened it anyway. Inside were J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. Both had been shot once in the head. There was no sign of robbery. Cash, jewelry, and J.B.'s credit cards were untouched inside the car. The one thing missing was her keychain, a small set of blocks spelling out "hard to get." Investigators would later note something else in the details. Both girls' pant legs were wet, and there was mud that didn't match the muddy but otherwise undamaged car. Signs later argued at trial that at some point that night, they had been somewhere else. Somewhere with wet ground, before they ended up in that trunk. Word spread through Dothan and Ozark fast. Two 17-year-old girls, killed on what was supposed to be a birthday night, found less than a mile from where they'd last been seen alive, asking a stranger for directions home. The investigation had a crime scene. It had a timeline. What it didn't have, for the next 20 years, was a name. More than 2 months after the murders, the Alabama State Crime Lab returned a finding that changed the direction of the entire investigation. Traces of semen were found on J.B.'s bra, panties, and skin. An unidentified palm print was also recovered from the inside of the trunk lid. District Attorney David Emery, who prosecuted for Dale and Geneva counties, put it plainly, this had to be treated as a sex offense, or something that came out of one. Find whoever left that semen sample, and they'd very likely have their killer. It gave investigators a real biological lead, but in 1999, DNA technology could only do one thing with a sample like that: compare it against people already in police custody or already convicted of a crime. It couldn't search for a stranger. It could only confirm or rule out someone already under suspicion, which meant the case now hinged entirely on who investigators could bring in front of it. The first person who came forward did so voluntarily. On September 1st, 1999, exactly a month after the bodies were found, 28-year-old Johnny William Barentine, a part-time mechanic who lived less than a mile from Herring Avenue, walked into the police station and told Ozark Police Chief Tony Spivey he had information about the case. What followed was a shifting, 4-hour interview. Barentine's story changed multiple times. First, he said he'd seen a black truck speeding away from the area that night. Then he said he'd given a ride to a stranger, a man with tattoos, who he'd seen near the store where the girls stopped for directions. In his final version, he claimed that man had gotten into a car with 2 girls he identified as the dead girls, told Barentine to follow, and that they'd ended up on Herring Avenue, where Barentine said he heard 2 gunshots before giving the man a ride away from the scene. In yet another version, he claimed the tattooed stranger was actually someone he knew, his neighbor. Investigators also looked into a man from Michigan who had been at a party near Herring Avenue that same night and couldn't account for several hours of his whereabouts, and a man from Mississippi who had been staying in Ozark around the time of the murders and left town shortly after. Each of these threads represented real hours, real resources, and real hope for 2 families who wanted, more than anything, a name. None of them would hold up. Barentine's story fell apart almost as quickly as he told it. In every one of his 6 versions of events, he never once mentioned any sexual assault, despite the fact that investigators already knew, from the crime lab report, that a sexual assault had occurred. It was the kind of detail a real witness to the crime would almost certainly have known. Barentine didn't. The neighbor he'd named as the tattooed man had a solid alibi for the entire night, and when DNA testing came back, it matched neither Barentine nor his neighbor. Barentine was arrested and held while the case against him was built, but it never got the chance to go to trial. When he appeared before a grand jury, he admitted the entire story had been fabricated. He'd made it up hoping to collect the reward money that had been raised for information leading to an arrest. He hadn't seen anything. He knew nothing. The grand jury declined to indict him, and he was released. It should have been a return to square one. Instead, it was worse than that. Investigators had spent weeks running down a story that never happened, chasing a confession built entirely on a lie. Time and resources that could have gone toward other leads, while the actual killer's trail grew colder by the day. The other leads collapsed just as completely. Investigators traveled to Michigan 3 times to question the man who'd been at a nearby party that night. His DNA didn't match. The man from Mississippi who'd left Ozark shortly after the murders was tracked down and tested. His DNA didn't match either. By the end of 1999, every lead the Ozark Police Department had pursued had run into the same wall, a DNA sample that belonged to someone, but matched no one they could find. Alabama's criminal database, the only tool available for comparison, could only search people who had already been arrested or convicted of a crime. The man who left that sample had never been arrested for anything in his life. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He simply didn't exist in any system capable of finding him. And so, with no more leads to chase and a piece of evidence that pointed at nobody, the investigation did the only thing left to do. It waited. For the Beasley and Hawlett families, the case never actually went quiet, even when the investigation did. Every year, at the end of July, family and friends gathered on Herring Avenue to hold a vigil for Beasley and Tracie. It became a fixture of the community's summer, in the same way the murders themselves had become a fixture of the town's memory. 2 crosses and a small memorial eventually marked the spot where the car had been found. The gatherings weren't only about mourning, they were strategic. The families wanted to keep the case visible, keep the public's attention on it, in the hope that visibility might shake something loose that 2 decades of official investigation hadn't. It worked, to a degree. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries, and Court TV's Haunting Evidence, the kind of national exposure that keeps a cold case alive in public memory even when a police department's active leads have dried up. None of it produced a match. Tracie's stepfather, Mike Roberts, spoke publicly more than once about what those years were actually like for the people left behind. The particular, isolating weight of losing a child to an unsolved murder, a grief with no name attached to it, and no endpoint in sight. The case accumulated its own mythology over the years, too. Theories, rumors, even an unfounded allegation years later that a police officer had been involved and the department had covered it up, a claim that would eventually be recanted by the woman who made it. None of it moved the investigation forward. What the case had, year after year, was the same thing it had in 1999, a DNA sample with no name attached to it, sitting in a lab, waiting on technology that didn't exist yet. By 2018, 19 years had passed since Tracie's last phone call to her mother. Beasley and Tracie's case had become one of the most well-known unsolved murders in Alabama history. Mentioned in anniversary news coverage, in true crime documentaries, in the quiet, persistent hope of 2 families who refused to let their daughters become a story without an ending. That same year, A case on the other side of the country was about to change what was possible. In April 2018, the country's attention turned to California, where investigators announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the man believed to be the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least a dozen murders and dozens of rapes across the 1970s and 80s. He'd evaded capture for more than 40 years. What finally caught him wasn't a new witness or a forced confession. It was a technique law enforcement had never used to solve a case before: genetic genealogy. The idea was different from traditional DNA matching. Criminal databases only contain DNA from people who've been arrested or convicted, which is exactly why a crime scene sample from someone with no criminal record, like the one sitting in an Alabama lab since 1999, would never produce a hit no matter how many years passed. Genetic genealogy took a different approach entirely. Instead of searching for the suspect directly, investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, sites like GeneMatch, where ordinary people voluntarily upload their own DNA to research family history and find relatives. From there, they could find partial matches to distant relatives and build outward from those matches into a full family tree, narrowing a list of possibilities down generation by generation until one person fit every detail of the case. It didn't search for the killer. It searched for the killer's family and let the family tree point to the individual. Ozark Police Chief Marlos Walker followed the DeAngelo case closely for an obvious reason. He had his own 20-year-old sample sitting untouched in a lab, and a case approaching its own 2-decade anniversary. With the anniversary coming up in 2019, the department decided to send the crime scene evidence to Parabon Nanolabs, a company in Reston, Virginia, that had played a role in the Golden State Killer identification and offered DNA phenotyping and genealogy services. Parabon ran the sample against public genealogy databases. The analysis built out a family tree connected to the DNA profile, and from that tree, investigators were able to identify an extended family in the Dothan, Ozark area, and eventually, a name: Coley McCraney. The name meant something to Walker immediately, not as a stranger flagged by an algorithm, but as someone he actually recognized, a name from his own high school years. McCraney was 45 years old at the time, a long-haul truck driver and a preacher who had co-founded a local church. He had no criminal record. Nothing in the past 20 years had ever connected his name to the case in any way. Walker didn't move on him as a suspect yet. He needed one more thing first: a direct sample, to confirm what the genealogy had already pointed to. Chief Marlos Walker didn't approach Coley McCraney as a suspect. He approached him as an old acquaintance who might be able to help. McCraney was asked to come in and give a DNA sample voluntarily, framed as assistance with a case the department was hoping to finally close. There was nothing in his life that gave him a reason to refuse. He had no criminal record. He was a respected figure in his community, a long-haul truck driver who had spent years working for trucking companies across Alabama, and a preacher who had co-founded a local church. At the time of the murders in 1999, he had been living on Lisenby Drive in Ozark, less than a mile from where JB's car was found on Herring Avenue, a detail that meant nothing to investigators for 20 years because nothing else about him had ever pointed their attention his way. He agreed to the swap. When the results came back, Walker said he was blown away. The DNA matched exactly. Chief Walker would later put it simply: DNA doesn't lie. On March 16, 2019, just short of the case's 20th anniversary, Coley Lewis McCraney was arrested and charged with rape and capital murder in the deaths of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. The reaction across Dothan and Ozark wasn't relief so much as disorientation. This wasn't a drifter, a stranger passing through, or someone already living on the margins of the community's trust. This was a name people recognized. A man who had spent 2 decades in plain sight, driving trucks across the state, preaching to a congregation, raising a family, while a single unmatched DNA sample sat in a lab less than a mile from where he'd been living the entire time. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall addressed the arrest directly at a press conference. "Cases like this aren't forgotten," he said. "They're never filed away, only ever waiting for the next lead." For 20 years, that next lead had been sitting inside McCraney's own DNA, in a system that had simply never had a reason to look at him, until the technology existed to look at everyone. The trial was delayed for years by the COVID-19 pandemic. It finally opened in April 2023 in Dale County, before Judge William Fillmore, nearly 24 years after the night JB and Tracie disappeared. Coley McCraney chose to take the stand in his own defense, a decision that meant facing direct cross-examination with no protection. His account was strikingly different from his flat denial at the time of his arrest. He testified that he'd met JB at the Wiregrass Commons Mall in Dothan in June of 1999, while dropping his then-girlfriend off at work. JB, he said, introduced herself as Jennifer. He claimed they exchanged phone numbers and arranged to meet in Ozark on the night of July 31st. According to McCraney, his truck broke down that night. He ran into the girls near the store where Tracie had called her mother, and the two of them, he and JB, had consensual sex in his truck before the girls dropped him back home around 12:45 a.m. Asked why he'd told police in 2019 that he didn't know either girl at all, McCraney said he'd been afraid his wife would find out he'd cheated on her. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Steve Marshall, worked to dismantle that account point by point. There was no record, no calls, no texts, no witness, placing JB and Coley McCraney in contact before that night. And the timeline itself worked against him. Marilyn Merritt, the woman who'd given the girls directions at the store, had already testified they were simply lost, asking how to get back to the highway. Nothing about the encounter suggested a planned meeting. Tracie's phone call to her mother, promising she and JB were on their way home, told the same story. The most damaging witness for the defense turned out to be McCraney's own wife. Jeanette McCraney testified that her husband had left their home around 10 p.m. that night to visit his parents and young son in Johnstown, roughly 2.5 miles away, and that he hadn't come home until close to 1 a.m., a stretch of time he could never fully account for. She also confirmed, using a map presented by the prosecution, the geography connecting the Big Little Store, Herring Avenue, and their own home on Lisenby Drive. It was Jeanette McCraney who had encouraged her husband to give police his DNA sample voluntarily back in 2019, believing at the time it would only help clear him. Using DNA evidence, the timeline, and the physical scene, prosecutors laid out their account of what happened. McCraney approached JB and Tracie after they left the store, held them at gunpoint, forced them to another location, raped JB, placed both girls in the trunk of JB's car, and shot each of them once before driving the car to Herring Avenue and abandoning it. On April 26, 2023, after 8 days of testimony, a Dale County jury found Coley McCraney guilty on all counts, capital murder and rape. The following day, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Carol Roberts, Tracie's mother, said she was in shock. They had waited 24 years, she said, for someone to finally be held accountable. Cheryl Burgoon, JB's mother, who had once described her daughter as a beautiful gift, broke down when the verdict was read. Coley McCraney is serving his life sentence at a maximum security Alabama prison. In the months following his conviction, his wife, Jeanette McCraney, held a public rally alongside supporters, maintaining that he had been wrongfully convicted on DNA evidence alone. His attorneys pursued an appeal, but in 2024, an Alabama appellate court upheld both his conviction and his sentence. In an interview from prison, McCraney continued to maintain his innocence, telling ABC News that people could call him a cheater, but that he hadn't killed anyone. Attorney General Steve Marshall, who led the prosecution, later said that bringing JB and Tracie's killer to justice reminded him why he became a prosecutor in the first place. For Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon, the verdict didn't undo 24 years of not knowing. Nothing could, but it answered the one question they had carried since 1999. This case also marked something larger. It was one of the earliest in the country to demonstrate that genetic genealogy could solve a cold case with no criminal record, no reliable witness, and no traditional lead to follow. Only a single DNA sample, stored for 2 decades, waiting on technology that didn't exist yet. In the years since, the same method has helped reopen hundreds of other cold cases across the United States. A few things from this case are worth carrying forward. Share your specific plans before you go out, not just where, but with whom, and when you expect to be back. If plans change, update someone immediately, the way Tracie did with that one phone call. Use real-time location sharing with someone you trust, especially at night or in an unfamiliar area. There's no reason today to be lost without anyone knowing where you are. If you're lost at night in an unfamiliar place, stay in the car with the doors locked and call for help rather than approaching strangers on foot when possible. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, even without a clear reason, leave, call 911, or head somewhere public. And perhaps the hardest lesson of this case, the person responsible isn't always a stranger from outside the community. For 20 years, he was a neighbor, a truck driver, a preacher, someone people had no reason to suspect, until DNA finally gave them one.